There are moments when economic power shifts quietly, not through war, not through elections, but through investment decisions. And this week, one of the largest technology companies on Earth made a move that sent shockwaves through Washington, global markets, and the future of North American manufacturing. Because when Samsung Electronics changes direction, entire economies adjust, and the United States just felt that shift. Section 1. The project that symbolized America's tech future. Just outside Austin, in Taylor, Texas, a massive semiconductor manufacturing project was supposed to redefine the future of American chip production. A multi-billion-dollar investment, advanced fabrication facilities, thousands of projected jobs. The site was intended to become one of the most important semiconductor hubs in North America, part of a broader U.S. strategy to reduce reliance on Asia for critical chip manufacturing. For policymakers in Washington, this project wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical. Semiconductors power everything: smartphones, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, military systems, control the chips, control the future. That's why the investment from Samsung was celebrated across political lines. It represented supply chain security, industrial revival, technological leadership. And for Texas, it was historic. For a while, the trajectory seemed clear. Investment announcements were bold, timelines were ambitious, and semiconductor manufacturing in North America looked like it was entering a new golden era. But over the past year, something shifted, quietly at first. Then, all at once, construction timelines began stretching beyond initial projections. Cost estimates moved upward, sometimes dramatically, and global semiconductor demand started moving in cycles instead of straight growth. Inside Samsung Electronics, conversations began changing tone. Not alarm, not retreat, reassessment. Because semiconductor expansion is never impulsive. It's one of the most calculated industrial decisions a company can make. And when the math changes, strategy follows. The pressure building beneath the surface semiconductor plants are among the most complex and expensive projects on Earth. Each facility requires billions in upfront capital, specialized equipment, supply chains, long-term energy reliability, skilled workforce pipelines, stable trade conditions. And once construction begins, companies aren't thinking in quarters. They're thinking in decades, 15 to 20 years of operational planning. That means every decision must survive. Political cycles, economic downturns, supply chain disruptions, global demand shifts. Any instability, even small, changes the equation. And recently, multiple variables began moving at once. Costs climbed faster than expected. Building advanced chip fabrication plants in North America has proven far more expensive than earlier projections. Labor costs rose, material costs fluctuated, infrastructure development stretched timelines, even logistics, transporting highly specialized semiconductor equipment, became more complex and costly. For companies like Samsung, these aren't minor budget adjustments. They're multi-billion-dollar recalculations. And when costs rise while demand becomes unpredictable, expansion strategies naturally slow. Not cancel, not abandon, rebalance. Demand stopped being predictable. During the global chip shortage, demand seemed endless. Automakers needed chips, tech companies needed chips, governments needed chips. Expansion looked inevitable. But over the past year, demand patterns became uneven. Some sectors cooled, others surged unexpectedly. AI demand exploded, while consumer electronics slowed. Data centers grew, while smartphone growth plateaued. For semiconductor manufacturers, volatility changes investment pacing. You don't build the next generation of fabrication plants unless long-term demand looks stable. Because once the factory is built, you must run it at scale for years to justify the cost. Policy became part of the calculation. Governments across North America pushed hard to attract chip manufacturing. In the United States, the CHIPS and Science Act signaled massive federal support. Incentives were promised. Funding frameworks were outlined. Strategic messaging was clear. Bring semiconductor production home, but implementation takes time. Companies must evaluate how quickly funds are distributed, regulatory approval timelines, environmental compliance requirements, workforce readiness. Even small delays can ripple through long-term planning, and multinational corporations operate on certainty, not political intent. Global competition intensified. At the same time, North America wasn't the only region making offers. Countries across Asia and Europe accelerated their own semiconductor incentive programs, faster permits, energy subsidies, tax advantages, infrastructure guarantees, which meant Samsung wasn't choosing between expansion and no expansion. It was choosing between multiple expansion paths, each with different cost structures, regulatory environments, geopolitical implications. That kind of decision doesn't happen quickly, and it rarely happens publicly. Inside the recalibration. This wasn't a dramatic overnight withdrawal, no sudden shutdown, no abrupt reversal. Instead, internal planning cycles began stretching. Teams revisited projected ROI timelines, equipment deployment strategies, regional investment sequencing, supply chain dependencies. The core question shifted from, where do we expand next, to, where does expansion make the most long-term sense? And that's a fundamentally different conversation, because it prioritizes durability over speed. Why semiconductor strategy moves slowly? Unlike consumer products, semiconductor manufacturing locks companies into long commitments. Once a fabrication plant is operational, supply contracts span years, workforce investments are fixed, equipment life cycles extend over decades, relocating or scaling back isn't easy, which is why companies pause before moving forward, not after. Every decision must survive not just today's market, but the world 10 or 15 years from now. The equation started evolving over the past year. Multiple forces began interacting. Rising costs, policy uncertainty, demand fluctuations, global competition. None of them alone would trigger a shift, but together, they changed the equation. And when the equation changes for a company operating at Samsung's scale, the ripple effects move far beyond corporate boardrooms. They reach financial markets, political institutions, global supply chains. Because semiconductor investment isn't just industrial planning anymore, it's strategic positioning. The turning point, momentum didn't collapse. It transformed. Expansion became more cautious. Announcements became more measured. Commitments became more conditional. This wasn't a retreat from North America. It was a signal that the next phase would be slower, more calculated, and more dependent on long-term certainty. And for policymakers who expected rapid industrial build-out, that shift mattered, because semiconductor dominance isn't secured by announcements. It's secured by execution. And execution depends on one thing above all: confidence in the future environment. Right now, that environment is still forming, which means the decisions being made today will shape where the world's most critical technology is built tomorrow. The United States is not the only country trying to attract semiconductor giants. Canada has launched aggressive industrial strategies, supply chain incentives, critical mineral partnerships, battery and semiconductor corridors. At the same time, global companies are balancing risk across multiple locations, not placing everything in one country, and that includes Samsung. Reports indicate the company has been diversifying, investment pacing facility timelines, geographic distribution, not abandoning the U.S., but not relying on a single location either. This is how global capital behaves. It spreads risk. Economic investment decisions rarely stay economic. They become political, because semiconductor manufacturing now sits at the center of national security trade negotiations, election messaging, global alliances, and leaders across the political spectrum have framed chip investment as proof of economic strength, including Donald Trump, who has repeatedly argued that aggressive trade policies and tariffs would push manufacturing back onto American soil. But corporations don't respond to speeches. They respond to incentives, supply chain access, cost predictability, long-term policy signals. And when those signals shift, strategies shift with them. Countries are no longer waiting passively for semiconductor investment. They're competing for it, strategically, financially, politically, and in some cases, urgently. Because attracting a semiconductor giant like Samsung Electronics doesn't just bring factories, it brings entire economic ecosystems, supply chains, engineering talent, infrastructure expansion, long-term geopolitical alignment, which is why governments across the world are now treating chip investment like a national priority, not just an economic opportunity. Canada's quiet but calculated push. Among the countries positioning themselves as alternatives, Canada has been increasingly active, not through loud announcements, but through policy signals and economic positioning. Financial leaders and policymakers, including figures like Mark Carney, have repeatedly emphasized the importance of industrial resilience, supply chain security, and long-term capital stability. The pitch to global tech companies is deliberate and focused. Predictable regulation, strong institutional credibility, access to energy and critical minerals, proximity to the United States market, lower political volatility compared to many regions. For corporations planning 20 to 30-year investments, those factors carry enormous weight. Because semiconductor plants aren't short-term bets, they're generational infrastructure. Why stability is becoming the deciding factor. For decades, companies prioritized cost above everything else, but semiconductor manufacturing changed that equation. Now, stability often matters more than incentives alone. Executives evaluate energy reliability trade agreements, political continuity, legal protections, workforce, pipelines, infrastructure readiness. A factory interruption, whether from policy changes, trade disputes, or regulatory slowdowns, can cost billions. So countries that can promise consistency suddenly become far more attractive. And that's exactly where global competition intensifies. The mineral advantage. Another major factor reshaping the competition is resource access. Modern semiconductors rely on rare earth materials, lithium, nickel, cobalt, advanced metals used in fabrication processes. Countries with stable mining sectors and secure export frameworks now have a strategic edge, not just because they supply materials, but because they can offer vertically integrated partnerships, production, processing, manufacturing, all within aligned political systems. The proximity strategy. Geography still matters. For Samsung, access to North American markets remains critical. That's why nearby industrial hubs, rather than distant manufacturing zones, have gained attention. Being close to U.S. customers means faster logistics, lower transport risk trade agreement, advantages, coordinated supply chains. So when countries pitch themselves, they're not just offering land, they're offering positioning inside a broader economic corridor. The long-game perspective, semiconductor companies don't think in election cycles. They think in decades, which means political continuity becomes a strategic asset. Will policies change after one election? Will incentives disappear? Will trade relationships shift? These questions matter just as much as tax benefits. And in a world where global tensions can reshape markets overnight, predictability becomes priceless. That's the environment shaping today's competition. Not just Canada, a global race. Canada is only one example. Across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East, governments are building aggressive semiconductor attraction strategies, offering subsidies, land grants, fast-tracked approvals, energy price guarantees, workforce training partnerships. Because the reality is clear, where chip manufacturing goes, economic influence follows. And once a semiconductor ecosystem forms, it tends to anchor itself for decades. Why this matters for Washington. This growing global competition changes the equation for U.S. policymakers. It means investment is no longer assumed. It must be secured, maintained, and continually justified, because companies like Samsung now have options, real ones. And when multiple countries offer stability, incentives, and long-term support, the decision stops being patriotic and becomes strategic. The underlying shift, what's happening, isn't a single negotiation. It's a structural transformation. Governments are no longer just regulating technology companies. They're competing for them, building national strategies around them. aligning foreign policy with industrial policy, and that raises the central question behind this entire story. In a world racing to secure semiconductor dominance, who will offer the most compelling future? Because whichever country wins that race won't just gain factories. It will gain leverage over the next era of the global economy. Here's the key truth. Samsung hasn't abandoned America. What's happening is more complex and more consequential. The company is balancing U.S. investments, Asian manufacturing dominance, North American expansion options, government incentive negotiations. Large multinationals often signal flexibility to strengthen their negotiating position. This influences subsidy packages, infrastructure commitments, policy guarantees. It's a chess game between governments and corporations. And right now, that chessboard spans Texas, Washington, Ottawa, Seoul. Because the implications go beyond one project. If semiconductor investments slow in the U.S., supply chain independence weakens domestic manufacturing goals, slow reliance on foreign fabs continues, and that becomes both economic and national security concern. Washington understands, whoever hosts the fabs hosts the future. Investors track these moves in real time. Semiconductor expansion decisions influence tech stock forecasts, energy demand, infrastructure growth, labor migration. Every delay or relocation reshapes billions in projected activity. And markets don't react to speeches. They react to capital movement. This isn't about one factory. It's about a global race. The US, Canada, South Korea, Japan, and Europe are all competing to host semiconductor plants, battery gigafactories, AI hardware supply chains. The country that wins that race defines the next industrial era. And companies like Samsung are at the center of it. Watch these signals. Government incentive adjustments, policy stability guarantees, semiconductor funding packages, new announcements from Samsung. Because decisions like this don't happen once. They unfold in phases, and each phase shifts the balance of technological power. The story isn't that Samsung left. The story is that global tech giants now have choices, and every choice they make reshapes jobs, supply chains, national security, and political narratives. This isn't just business. It's the future of technological power, and the next move is already being planned. The moment the announcement surfaced, officials across United States policy circles began scrambling for clarity, because this wasn't just about one company, it was about the backbone of America's technology future. And the company at the center of it all, Samsung Electronics, isn't just another global brand. It is one of the world's most critical semiconductor manufacturers, a supplier, a strategic partner, and in many ways, a pillar of the West's technological supply chain. For years, Washington had invested enormous political capital into bringing semiconductor manufacturing back onto American soil. Billions in incentives, legislative pressure, national security framing, all designed to reduce reliance on overseas chip production. So when reports emerged that Samsung was reassessing key expansion decisions tied to North America, the reaction inside policy circles was immediate. Because this wasn't just a business recalibration. It was interpreted as a signal, and possibly a warning. The strategic importance semiconductors are not just used in phones. They power military systems, energy grids, autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, financial infrastructure. Control over chip production is now viewed as control over the future economy. That's why recent years saw a global race. Governments funding domestic chip plants, trade alliances forming around supply chains, technology becoming a national security priority. Samsung sat at the center of that race, which meant any shift, even a cautious one, carried geopolitical consequences. Inside Washington's reaction, policy analysts began asking the same question. Was this temporary hesitation or a structural shift? Because if a major semiconductor partner slowed its U.S. footprint, it could signal rising cost pressures, regulatory friction, political uncertainty, global supply chain realignment. Behind closed doors, discussions focused on a single concern, America's long-term semiconductor independence. Officials had assumed private industry would follow the incentives, but corporate decisions follow profitability, not political timelines. And that's where tensions started to emerge. Markets noticed first. Before politicians spoke publicly, markets reacted quietly. Technology investors began monitoring expansion timelines, capital allocation shifts, international partnerships. Because when a company like Samsung adjusts strategy, it often reflects deeper global calculations, not just quarterly performance, but long-term positioning, where future demand will come from, where manufacturing is sustainable, where geopolitical risks are lower. The global angle. At the same time, international observers saw something else. Competition. Countries around the world have been aggressively courting semiconductor investment, offering tax incentives, infrastructure guarantees, energy subsidies, regulatory fast-tracking, which means every hesitation in one country becomes an opportunity in another. And that dynamic raises a bigger question. Is this about one decision or the beginning of a global reshuffle? Why this moment feels different. Major corporations review investments all the time. That's normal. But this situation stood out for three reasons. Timing, happening amid intense tech competition sector. Semiconductors are now geopolitical assets. Scale. Samsung operates at a level few companies match, which turned what could have been a quiet corporate update into a political moment. A moment where business strategy collided with national priorities. And once that happens, the story stops being about a company and starts being about power. The narrative forming in Washington inside media and policy spaces, a new narrative began forming. Is the U.S. losing momentum in the global tech race? Not because of innovation, but because of cost, regulation, and speed. Some argued America still leads in research. Others warned manufacturing could drift elsewhere. And semiconductor production is the one area where losing ground has long-term consequences. Because once supply chains move, they rarely move back quickly. What comes next? This decision doesn't mean an exit. It doesn't mean a collapse. And it doesn't signal a crisis. But it does mark something important, a moment of recalibration for Samsung, for Washington, and for the global semiconductor race itself. And in politics and economics, recalibration often comes before major shifts. The real question now isn't what happened, it's what happens next. Because the next moves, from governments, investors, and competitors, will determine whether this becomes a short-term headline or the start of a long-term strategic turning point.